Waltzing with a Dictator. When the CIA officer arrived at the modern, sprawling Forbes Park residence of the American ambassador to the Philippines, he found the occupant, Henry Byroad, relaxing with his evening drink. The diplomat was handed a neatly typed document of about 15 pages. It was Proclamation 1081, the justification skillfully drafted by Ferdinand edralin Marcos for placing his country under martial law. Earlier that evening, it had been handed to a Central Intelligence Agency officer by one of the Rolex, as they were to be dubbed the principal planners of martial law. 10 military officers, the Minister of Defense, and a businessman, to whom Marcos later presented gold Rolex watches in appreciation of their participation. Talk about the possibility of martial law had been buzzing through Manila for weeks. But it had been little more than that. Rumors and concern. Then, on Sunday, September 17, 1972, a Filipino who had been recruited by the agency to provide information earned his keep. He informed the station that martial law would be declared on Tuesday. The next day he called back. Martial law had been postponed until Thursday or Friday. That was the most concrete intelligence the embassy had received. Until it was handed the Proclamation 1081, Byroad read the decree slowly. Another ambassador probably would have consulted Washington. Byroad, however, was anything but a typical diplomat. Indeed, he was one of the most extraordinary men in the annals of the soldier-statesman. He had been the youngest general in the history of the American Army, promoted by George Marshall in China, where Byroad once went wading with Zhou Enlai, an authentic Horatio Alger character. Look magazine wrote in a column about men who fascinate women. When he was 41 years old, prototype of the grown-up American boy, he could pose for patriotic posters. As a soldier, he was at the center of the Berlin blockade crisis. As a diplomat, he was involved in the planning of the CIA coup that put the Shah in power in Iran. The John Wayne of ambassadors, as one aide remembered him. Byroad frequently crashed his career on the shoals of his own fiercely independent streak and his womanizing. But he always managed to recover. The Philippines was his fifth ambassadorial post. Pakistan would be his sixth, a record surpassed by only one other American in the 20th century. And when Henry Byroad finally retired, the CIA honored him in a private ceremony at the agency headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a very rare tribute for an ambassador. Not surprisingly, Byroad didn't ask Washington what he should do about Marcos' proposed action. After reading Proclamation 1081, he called Marcos, asked if he could come over to discuss a matter. Without saying what, Marcos, closer to Byroad than he had been or would be to any other American ambassador during his 20th years in power, said of course without changing from his sport shirt. Byrowood slipped into the back seat of his chauffeured black limousine, with the miniature American flags fluttering on the front fenders for the 20th to 30th minute drive across town to Malacanang, the presidential residence. He did not take the proclamation with him, concerned that his possession of it might reveal to Marcos who among the 12 was his Judas. Byrowood told Marcos that Washington would react strongly if the Philippine president toppled the Philippine democracy, especially the Congress. It was the same argument that Ambassador had made in earlier discussion with Marcos about martial law. Though never very forcefully, Byrowood, though he had succeeded in persuading Marcos not to take this drastic action. But he was wrong about Marcos, and he was wrong about the Washington reaction. After leaving Marcos, Byrowood advised Washington of what he had done. The cable was sent not through the regular channel, the State Department, but through the CIA transmission facilities back channel to the National Security Council, headed by Henry Kissinger. It was marked eyes only. The CIA station sent Langley several of its own messages, one of which contained the text of Proclamation 1081. In Manila, the CIA was prepared for what now seemed to be the inevitable, worried that when martial law came, there would be a curfew and other restriction on movement which would make it difficult for the CIA agent to maintain contact with their sources. The station had distributed shortwave radios to some of its most important assets. The assets had code names: Eagle 2, Eagle 3, etc. The station chief was Eagle 1. On Friday, September 22, Eagle 2 reached Eagle 1, "This is it. All systems are go," was the cryptic message. The CIA knew what it meant. Earlier in the day, another of the CIA Philippine assets had provided the station with a list of the persons Marcos planned to arrest and imprison. At 9 o'clock, Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law. The reaction of Washington was mostly silent detachment, except for its emphatic insistence that suggestion the United States had any advanced knowledge were flatly wrong. The United States had not been consulted, the State Department said, and it was not informed and in advance of the President Marcos' intention to declare martial law. From Manila, it was reported that American embassy officers had been the day seeking information about the surprise martial law decree. At best, the denial was a half-truth, the surprise feigned, yet over the years, this official statement have held. The standard history of the imposition of martial law maintains that the United States was not involved. It knew nothing. Maybe the United States didn't know the exact hour and minute, but it knew just about everything else. On September 13, the embassy alerted Washington that Marcos was studying emergency measures, including martial law, that had prompted the State Department to cable back for more details. And on the 19th, 3 days before martial law was declared, the State Department in highly classified cable, it was marked secret with a further restriction that it was to be distributed not through the normal channels but only to the very highest level of officials. asked by Rowade for his evaluation of likelihood that Marcos will impose martial law in near future. If Washington had wanted to defend democracy in the Philippines, it could have sent a very strong message to Marcos that martial law would not be tolerated, that there would be a cut-off of aid or some other step taken if he usurped democracy. No such message was ever sent, and Marcos had reason to be confident that it wouldn't be. Marcos said afterward that he had prayed to God for guidance before making the fateful decision, contrary to what was officially stated. He had also consulted with Washington, especially with the President of the United States, Richard M. Nixon. In the days before his proclamation of martial law, Marcos spoke with Nixon at least once, telling the American president what he was about to do. He heard no objection. Democracy mugged. The stage was set for President and Imelda Marcos for their conjugal dictatorship. It was the stage they had calculatingly designed. They were driven by what seemed to be a modern-day, third-world version of the divine right of kings. He wanted the power to rule forever and ever. He was obsessed with society and money, with accumulating possessions and people. They made possible their future by erasing the fictionalizing their past. Marcos had beaten a murder charge as a teenager, covered up his father's wartime collaboration, then set about fabricating a legend about himself as a fearless, decorated guerrilla. She squandered few $1 million to build her ancestral homes, an attempt to buy a heritage of family wealth and prominence, with the reality was that her father was the family ne'er-do-well, and that as a child she had lived in a garage. The Marcoses carried on through 5 Americans administration, 3 Republican and 2 Democratic. American governments watched as the Marcoses robbed the Philippines people of between $5 and $10 billion, larceny and looting that began even before Marcos had declared martial law. Washington looked on as he emasculated the country's democratic institution. The courts, the schools, the political parties. He corrupted the superb army that had been created by General Douglas MacArthur, sapping it of the ability and morale to fight the communist-led insurgency. During the Marcos reign, and because of Marcos, the Philippine Communists grew stronger and stronger. By 1985, they were closing in on taking power, yet through it all, Marcos remained Washington man in Manila. After 1972, Ferdinand Marcos was a dictator in the dictionary definition. He had the authority and control to issue the decrees by which the people were governed without their consent. He was not, however, the classic dictator, less ruthless, probably much smarter and shrewder than most. He was not above bribery and intimidation, employing both whenever they were needed to achieve his goals. But he was a brilliant political tactician, a match for Lyndon Johnson, and at the beginning of his career, a charismatic speaker reminiscent of John F. Kennedy, and he was an absolute master of the American political system. He knew more about the system in intricacies and nuances, and about the men who ran if than they ever did about his country and the man who ran it. He deployed his knowledge, ingenuity, and running to extract far made from Uncle Sam than he ever gave. At each turning point, each showdown, whether over Vietnam or human rights, Marcos stood his ground. It was always the powerful United States that blinked. From the beginning of his political career, Ferdinand Marcos had been frank about his ambition. If you are electing me just to get my services as a congressman for the pittance of 7,500 pesos a year, don't vote for me at all. He shouted at rallies during his first campaign in 1949. For the seat that his father had held when the archipelago was an American colony. This is only a first step. Elect me a congressman now, and I pledge you an Ilocano president in 20 years. He was elected at the age of 22, the youngest member of the House of Representatives, and this was one political promise Marcos kept. En route to never suffering an electoral defeat in his 1959 quest for a Senate seat, he won a landslide victory, gathering far more votes than any of the CIA-backed candidate. It took Marcos only 16 years, not 20, to deliver on his boast. Not surprisingly, it seemed he was always in a hurry. A bit ahead of everyone else, Ferdinand Edralin Marcos was in such a hurry to be born that his father, who was only 18 years old himself, had to act as midwife, according to the authorized Marcos biography. In fact, young Ferdinand scarcely waited for his parents to graduate from normal school before he put in his appearance, thus bringing to light a secret marriage. Ferdinand's father, Mariano, became a lawyer and politician. His mother, Josefa, the daughter of well-to-do landowners, was a school teacher. Their roots were in Ilocos Norte, the northernmost hard-scrabble region of the archipelago, where Ferdinand began life on September 11, 1917, while a strong sense of obligation, along with boundless hospitality, is generally considered common to all Filipinos. Inhabitants of the various geographic regions exhibit unique characteristics. In the south are the Muslims, adventuresome and freedom-loving, said to be the best friends and worst enemies of can have. The northern Ilocanos are a hardly industrious people renowned for their frugality. Above all, the Ilocanos are known as survivor. Beyond the date of his birth and a few other bare-bones details such as names of his parents and brothers and sisters and the dates of his political victories. To write with confidence about Marcos' early years, it is made difficult by the extensive misinformation, conflicting facts, and intentional disinformation. The biographical quotient is underscored by an observation of Ferdinand's mother while her son was growing up. He would probably be a novelist, she thought, considering the well-constructed, imaginative tales with what it took U.S. diplomats and journalists 20 years to discover. Marcos could tell the most brazen lie with the straightest of faces, then continue telling it until it became accepted as fact. There is only one full-length account of Marcos' life for every tier of victory, released in 1964 as part of his presidential campaign. Over the years, the material in the book became the basis for what journalists wrote and American officials believed. It is styled as a biography written by Hartzell Spence, who had been an editor of Yank during World War II. It is really an autobiography. As told to Spence, the book is without footnotes and contains few internal references. Most of the material could have come only from Marcos, embellishing and prevaricating to create himself in his own grandiose image. Doubt about the reality of the book begin with the original title, which comes from what Marcos purported to tell his mother when informing her that her husband has been killed by the Japanese during the war. I promise you, mother, after this war, for every tear you shed now, a victory. Whether Marcos indeed said that is irrelevant, for his father was killed not by the Japanese, but an anti-Japanese guerrilla unit. Mariano Marcos was a collaborator. According to the Marcos Spence account, Marcos was always the first, the youngest, the best in everything. But the age of 10, so their story goes, Marcos had been taught by his grandfather to shoot, ride, and track wild animals in the jungle. During summers in Davao, on the country's southernmost islands of Mindanao, where his father had been appointed governor, one of the young boy duties was to shoot the deer gazing among the cattle. Without disturbing the domestic stock, he was trilingual, Ilocano, English, and Spanish, and added a fourth language, Latin, for his school essays. And of course, wrote Spence, read the classics in all four of these tongues, even discounting the myth-making and boasting. Marcos' accomplishments were extraordinary. Even if he wasn't the outstanding athlete of his time, he was certainly a valued member of the university wrestling, boxing, swimming teams and captains of the rifle and pistol teams. As President Marcos, 5 feet 6 inches and a wiry 130 pounds, who neither smoked nor drank, was probably one of the most fit and athletic world leader. Whether or not, while in college, he was the country's best orator, he did use the campus soapbox with success, on the same campus that would breed those students who railed against him a generation later. There is no gainsaying that Marcos was extremely intelligent. While studying for the bar exam, he boasted that he would have the highest score. He did. The accomplishment all the more remarkable considering that the most surely have been distracted by the arrest and murder charge hanging over him. On September 20, 1935, a rainy, windy night, black as sin was how the prosecutor later described it. Someone hidden in a fruit grove fired a bullet into the back of Julio Nalundasan as he stood some 25 feet away, starkly silhouetted in the window, about to rinse his mouth after dinner. Nalundasan had been cut down with a single shot. The murder weapon was a pistol used in competition. With an 8-inch barrel, Ferdinand Marcos, who had celebrated his 18th birthday 9 days before the murder, was a crack shot on the ROTC pistol and rifle teams. Marcos had a motive, one that reflected the often violent store of the Philippine politics and the ferocity of family loyalty. Nalundasan had just defeated Ferdinand's father, Mariano, in the first national election under Archipelago's Commonwealth status with the United States. On top of the political humiliation on the day before the murder, Nalundasan's followers had heaped public ridicule upon Mariano. They placed a coffin labeled Marcos in a rumble seat, then drove through the villages, finally arriving at the home of Mariano Marcos, while a band played a mocking dirge. The victors, wiping away false tears, hooted and jeered, "Marcos is dead, long live Nalundasan." The wheels of justice ground slowly, and it was not until December 7, 1938, that Marcos was arrested, seized while he was sitting in an evening law class. He was charged with having fired the fatal shot. His father and uncle were charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The case was made for Philippine newspaper, which delighted in sensational stories. Marcos was a student leader at the top of his class, academically about to be graduated as valedictorian. When the trial began, reported and photographers scrambled each day with the locals who wanted one of the 40 or so spectator seats in the small courtroom. The trial dragged on nearly 2 months. Marcos' mothers appeared every day, and the fresh law graduate participated in his own defense. He deeply impressed the court whenever he took an active part in the defense of his own case. The judge wrote on his opinion. The judge was also impressed by young Marcos' accomplishments and potential, hailing him as one of a brilliant among our young men. In the opinion of his court, he is a youth with a great future, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the judge found him guilty of murder, sentencing him to up to 17 years in prison. His father and uncle were acquitted. Once the verdict had been delivered, Marcos assumed almost complete responsibility of his own defense. His impassioned 30-minute argument to the trial judge that he be allowed to remain free to prepare his appeal before the Supreme Court brought tears to the eyes of spectators, court employees, and even the judge himself. The daily papers printed it in full. The lawyer's journal declared that even short of its emotionalism, the plea was clear and brilliant piece of legal argumentation, but again Marcos lost. Marcos became a jailhouse lawyer, though he was allowed to work in a sunny hall rather than spend all his time confined in his windowless cell in the 200-year-old prison in Lawag. Marcos' flair was reflected in his Supreme Court brief, though impressive in length, 830 pages, in 3 volumes. It was the court noted in its opinion more valuable for its literary value than for the strength and the exposition of legal argument. When he appeared before the black-robed justices, Marcos was a vision in white, a white double-breasted shark-skin suit and white shoes, a sartorial statement of his purity. Marcos claimed that the trial and appeals had drained the family's resources. This is true makes all the more acute question about the prodigious wealth he subsequently amassed. But he prevailed the weekly Philippine Free Press, which Marcos was too close when he declared martial law, put his photo on the cover a public hero. In reversing the conviction, the Supreme Court cited a number of trial court's errors, but it is widely believed that the justices, in order to reach the desired outcome, had stretched to find the narrow technical grounds. What likely swayed the justices were the arguments to his brethren by Justice Jose P. Laurel that the fledgling democracy needed young people with the intelligence and leadership potential the young Marcos had already displayed. The saddling him with a criminal conviction would do more harm to the country than to the individual. Whatever the reasons, legal or emotional, Marcos was forever grateful to Laurel, who wrote the High Court opinion, and his family. During the war, Laurel collaborated with the Japanese, and records in U.S. archives suggest that Marcos helped him. When Laurel died in 1959, Marcos delivered a eulogy, and he later became a trustee of the Jose P. Laurel Foundation, set up to perpetuate the memory of Laurel in grateful recognition of his patriotic endeavors. Later, when Marcos declared martial law, he used his dictatorial powers to destroy many of the country's economically and politically potent families. One of the few families left untouched was the Laurels, allowed to keep their extensive land holdings, a bank, and a beach resort. The Chief Justice's son, Salvador Laurel, was a loyal Marcos political ally until the late 1970s. And when Laurel did eventually split with Marcos, he was not, as were so many anti-Marcos politicians, jailed or forced into exile. In displaying this loyalty to the Laurels, Marcos was exhibiting utang na loob, debt of gratitude, the obligation that one owes to a friend or person who has helped him. It is a deeply rooted trait, one that permeates Filipino relationship. The fierce loyalty to the family and to one's region is somewhat comparable to Sicilian loyalty. In the understanding of Philippine politics, this loyalty cannot be overemphasized. Almost invariably, notes the eminent Philippine historian Teodoro Agoncillo. The Filipino believes that a candidate from his province or region, no matter how repugnant, is better than one who comes from another region. These loyalties explain in large measure why Marcos would not dismiss General Fabian Ver as the Armed Forces Chief of Staff in spite of U.S. pressure to do so in the aftermath of the assassination of Benigno Ninoy Aquino in 1983. A murder in which U.S. officials insisted Ver was involved. Ver and Marcos had been playmates on the beaches of Sarat. And as Marcos acquired more power, so did Ver, rising from the president's chauffeur to chief of palace security to armed forces chief of staff. Marcos would not turn his back on Ver, even though sticking with his fellow Ilocano caused most critical support in Washington. The murder rap beaten, Marcos soon found himself at war if Marcos, through his biographer, stretched the truth about his early life. It snapped when he recounted his military years. About all that can be written with certainty about Marcos' war years is that he was guerrillas fighter. He was captured and imprisoned by the Japanese, and he was decorated. Spence's account of Marcos's war years begins. General Douglas MacArthur pinning on Ferdinand Marcos the Distinguished Service Cross for valor in battle far beyond the call of duty, commented publicly that without Ferdinand's exploit, Bataan would have fallen 3 months sooner than it did. If Marcos did it so perform, it would have been one of the most significant actions in the defense of Bataan. Yet, MacArthur in his reminiscences doesn't mention any such heroic action by Marcos, nor is it mentioned in the many books about MacArthur. According to John Sharkey, the Washington Post reporter who was the first American journalist to challenge Marcos' war medals claims. Moreover, Marcos' name does not appear on official U.S. government list of officials and Americans who were awarded Distinguished Service Crosses for their bravery at Bataan, one of which was compiled by MacArthur headquarters in Tokyo after the war ends. Marcos' alleged bravery at Bataan also earned him a recommendation for the U.S. Congressional Medal of Honor. According to Marcos and Spence, but there are no records in the U.S. Army achieve of any such recommendation. Marcos also claimed to have won 2 U.S. Silver Star. Altogether, Marcos said he received at least 30 awards, medals, and citation. The exact number varies in this account, usually between 27 and 33. If he did, not only was he as claimed the most decorated Filipino soldier in history, but Audie Murphy, who received 27 awards, becomes a footnote. It all was a monumental fraud, and Marcos was nothing if not daring in perpetuating it. According to the Spence Marcos account, one day Marcos, who was in Washington lobbying for Philippine veterans benefit, passed General Omar Bradley. Seeing Marcos' 6 rows of medals, the 4-star general saluted the lieutenant. Marcos carried it off for 30 years at the time of Marcos' victory in 1965. The New York Times, in its Man in the News feature, said that he had won 22 American and Philippine medal, that he had been commended by General Douglas MacArthur for his exploits in the defense of Bataan. And that his father had been bayoneted by the Japanese. As for some of Marcos' other medals, the ones bestowed upon him by the Philippine government, he did receive them, but the reasons are somewhat suspicious. 5 of them were awarded in the early 1950s, while Marcos was a leading member of the House Defense Committee. And 18 years after the war was over, in 1963, Marcos received an astonishing 10 medals, 9 of them on a single day in December, 2 Distinguished Conduct Stars, 2 Distinguished Service Stars, 2 Gold Cross medals, 3 wounded personnel medals. This burst of medal mania might well have been prompted by the Defense Department's desire to earn reciprocal gratitude from Marcos, who was chairman of the Senate Appropriation Committee. Marcos' medal claims make him the biggest liar in history, says Romulo Manriquez. 5 years after graduating near the top of his class from the Philippine Military Academy, Manriquez joined the American Army, in which he reached the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He left the Philippines in the mid-1950s, eventually becoming a lone officer with the Veterans Administration in Washington, D.C. Manriquez confirms that Marcos was captured by the Japanese at Bataan in April 1942. Marcos says he was brutally tortured during his imprisonment, but that after Marcos' release a month later, he did nothing. He traded in the black market. From November 1944 until March 1945, Manriquez was Marcos' commanding officer. Other military commanders agrees that Marcos' war record is bogus. I think a lot of what Manriquez says is true, says Gregory Swick, who was a U.S. Army major in the Philippines during the war. Marcos never got all the medals he says he got. Swick was honored by Marcos during a celebration commemorating the 25th anniversary of the fall of Bataan. During the ceremony, Swick talked with 6 or 7 officers who had known Marcos well during the war. They described Marcos' claims as pure BS. According to Marcos, he had been the commander of Filipino guerrillas who belonged to a unit he claimed to have organized ang mga maharlika, the nobles. After becoming President Marcos, he named a palace auditorium Maharlika Hall, a major north-south road, the Maharlika Highway, and even sought to change the country's name from the Philippines to Maharlika. It was appropriate tribute for a guerrilla unit that distinguished itself. The only problem was that the unit was little more than a typewriter organization, a fiction spawned by Marcos' quest for hero status and money. After the war, Marcos prepared a 29-page document containing the purported history of the unit, which he claimed had 8,300 members. If Marcos' claims had been accepted, all the men would have been entitled to back pay and benefits from the United States. At the time of the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, MacArthur promised that Filipinos who fought against the Japanese would be compensated after the war, and Marcos, for his services, would have enriched himself considerably. The Maharlika unit that existed during the war never consisted of more than 100 or so men, and its military activities were of very little value. According to American Army's records, an extensive investigation by the U.S. Army in 1948 concluded that Marcos' claim to have led a unit of this size was not only fraudulent, but a malicious criminal act. Finally, and perhaps even more incredibly in views of Marcos' attempt to depict himself as a wartime hero, Marcos was arrested during the war by a U.S. Army captain for illegally collecting money. Normally, he would have been held until after liberation, but he was released. For even back then, as an American Army officer wrote, Marcos had enough political prestige to bring pressure to bear where it is needed for his own personal benefit. There is further evidence that Marcos, far from being the leader of a guerrilla unit and deserving of decoration, may have been a collaborator. His father had welcomed the Japanese to Lawag, the capital of Marcos' home province of Ilocos Norte, in 1942, and later became a propagandist for the occupation, a job for which he said he had been recommended by his son Ferdinand. When the war ended, Marcos launched his successful political career. It was from his mother that Marcos acquired desire to excel, so fierce that he cannot abide to be second to anyone in anything. As Spence put it, it was from his father that he learned the rules for how to get to the top. To Marcos' father, said to be stern and humorless, the cliche applies. Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. The father emphasis was not sportsmanship. It was on the victory, writes Spence for his political rallies. Mariano Marcos gathered crowds by arranging boxing matches between the local boys and his two sons, Ferdinand and his younger brother Pacifico. Don't start a fight until you know you can win it, Marcos advised his son. And the corollary, never make an important move until you can choose your own battleground. These admonitions became the political principles to which Ferdinand Marcos rigidly adhered for nearly 4 decades. He never lost an election, never suffered a political defeat until the final ignominious one. But it wasn't just his intelligence, canniness, booming baritone oratory, and phony war record which Marcos parlayed into a stunning political reign. He had another asset, Imelda Romualdez, a proudly packaged 36, 23, 35. Was how time failed by her beauty, nor would be, at least, be the last. And she would not stay the submissive, remain in the background politician's wife. It was she, more than he, who put the bite on businessmen for large and regular donation. In addition to accumulating money, she acquired political power. She was to become governor of Manila, a virtual head of state, and de facto foreign minister. And in the latter capacity, she seemed to challenge Henry Kissinger records for most miles traveled, and heads of state met from Castro to Gaddafi to the leaders of the Soviet Union and 6 American presidents. Imelda Marcos' early years are as clouded by her own myth-making as are Marcos by his. There is, however, a reliable biography about her, The Untold Story of Imelda Marcos, written by Carmen Navarro Pedrosa, a journalist. When the manuscript was finished in 1969, Pedrosa gave it to Imelda Marcos to read. She moved heaven and earth to keep it from coming out. Pedrosa recalled Pedrosa withheld publication until after the 1969 campaign. After martial law had been declared, she had her husband were forced into exile. Pedrosa characterizes Imelda Marcos' life as a Cinderella story.